Adrienne Harlow's car died without warning on a two-lane stretch of Route 9, somewhere north of Poughkeepsie, 60 miles from the meeting that was supposed to save everything she had ever built. The dashboard lights blinked once, the engine went silent, and the sedan drifted to a stop on a gravel shoulder hemmed in on both sides by October maples that had already turned the color of dried blood. She tried the ignition 3 times. Each attempt produced only a faint click, as though the car itself had decided that enough was enough. She stepped out into cold air carrying the smell of coming rain and held her phone above her head until her arm ached. No signal, not even one bar. The sealed envelope on the passenger seat, the one she had read 7 times since it arrived on heavy cream paper 2 days ago, sat where she had left it, bearing the gold crest of the Granger estate and an address in the small upstate town of Galena. She had until 4 o'clock in the afternoon to reach it. The letter had warned that failure to appear by the appointed hour would transfer all negotiating rights to a second party, and she did not need to guess who that second party was. Preston Wycliffe had been circling Harlow MedTech for 3 years, and the debt her company owed his investment firm had grown into something that felt less like financing and more like a leash. The first drops of rain arrived when a gray work van with a cracked side mirror slowed on the opposite shoulder and then crossed the yellow line to park behind her. The man who stepped out was somewhere in his late 40s, wide-shouldered, wearing a canvas jacket with a Slade biomedical repair patch stitched over the chest pocket. He crossed the road without hurrying and introduced himself simply as Declan. He asked if she'd mind him taking a look. Adrienne minded considerably, but she was also standing on the shoulder of an empty highway with rain picking up and 4 o'clock approaching like a deadline on a very short document. She told him to go ahead. Declan Slade lifted the hood and spent approximately 45 seconds examining the control unit before he straightened and told her with the kind of calm that comes from having delivered bad news many times that the electronic module had not failed on its own. The failure signature was too clean, he said, too specific to a single subsystem to be ordinary wear. He could not fix it here, and he doubted it could be fixed by accident. Adrienne almost said something cutting about a van repairman diagnosing her $80,000 vehicle. She held it back because something in the precision of his language gave her pause. She asked if he was going anywhere near Galena. He considered the question for a moment and told her he could take her wherever she needed to go. She climbed into the passenger seat of the van and tucked her coat around her knees and told herself she would be at that estate in time. On the console between the seats sat a paper coffee cup covered in purple crayon stars, the kind of decoration that belongs to a child working very seriously on something important. A small purple backpack was wedged behind the passenger seat. A photo was taped to the far corner of the dash. A man she recognized as Declan, younger by several years, holding a little girl with red berets, who was squinting into the sun with the concentrated joy of someone who had just eaten ice cream and intended to eat considerably more of it. She did not ask about the child. She checked her watch instead. They drove north through the valley as the rain settled into something steady and gray, and Adrienne watched the hills close in on either side and tried to calculate how much time she had left. She offered Declan Slade money if he would drive faster. He declined without heat, noting that the road was wet and that no appointment in the world was worth a vehicle going sideways on a mountain curve. The refusal arrived with a finality that made argument feel beside the point. She said, more sharply than she intended, that he could not possibly understand what it meant to carry the weight of 300 jobs and a family name that had been attached to medical imaging technology for 2 decades. Declan said, without looking away from the road, that responsibility didn't announce itself by its size. The remark settled into the cab and stayed there. Adrienne chose not to respond. What she could not ignore was the way he talked. The conversation drifted, as long drives do, and somewhere past a bend marked by a broken fence post, Declan made a passing observation about the van's own diagnostic software that referenced a specific calibration protocol she had only ever seen in regulatory submissions. She asked, cautiously, where a repair technician had come across that kind of knowledge. He said he'd worked in a different field once. Before things changed, he did not elaborate. Her phone caught a thread of signal somewhere on a ridge, enough for a single message to arrive. It was from Miles Harford, her chief operating officer, terse and clipped in the way Miles always communicated when he was managing a crisis he didn't want her to see clearly. Preston Wycliffe had arrived at the Granger estate early. He was getting impatient. Miles recommended she agree to whatever terms were on the table when she arrived, rather than risk losing Wycliffe's goodwill entirely. Declan's hands moved fractionally on the wheel at the name Wycliffe. He said nothing. Adrienne filed it away alongside every other small thing about this man that did not quite fit the patch on his jacket. She asked him directly where in Galena he was headed. Rather than answering, Declan reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a sealed envelope. The gold crest pressed into its face was identical to the one she had been carrying since Tuesday. Adrienne read the address on his envelope aloud, number 14 Granger Hill Road, and watched his face. He eased his foot off the accelerator, as though he needed a moment to think. He asked her to say it again, and when she did, he pulled the van onto a wide gravel turnout and opened his envelope with careful, unhurried fingers and held it, so she could see the crest, the date, the time, the verification code, printed in small type along the bottom edge. Everything matched. The cold that moved through Adrienne Harlow had nothing to do with the rain. Her letter had described itself as a private negotiation involving exactly one other designated party. She had assumed, since the moment she read it, that the other party was Preston Wycliffe. Now she sat in a work van beside a man she had met 40 minutes ago on the shoulder of a highway, and his letter bore the same seal and the same impossible summons. She began, very quickly, to suspect that Declan Slade had been placed on that road deliberately, that the breakdown of her car, the convenient arrival of his van, the shared destination, that all of it was engineered, a setup, a way for someone working for Preston Wycliffe to get close to her before she walked into a negotiation she didn't fully understand. Declan seemed to read the calculation happening behind her eyes. He simply handed the envelope across without protest and let her examine it as long as she needed, offering no defense beyond the document itself. The seals matched. The signatures matched. Even the texture of the paper was identical. The only difference she could find was in the designation printed beneath his name. Her letter called her the commercial steward of the Granger estate. His called him the technical custodian. She had never once encountered that phrase in 20 years of reading contracts. Declan said that he had worked for Theodore Granger for 6 years, until things ended the way they ended. He did not say more. The name Theodore Granger struck a memory loose in Adrienne's mind. A pioneering figure in medical AI, whose company, Granger Diagnostics, had collapsed 7 years ago following a data breach that destroyed years of clinical trial records and cost several institutional investors tens of millions of dollars. She remembered reading, distantly, that the engineer responsible had been dismissed and stripped of his professional certifications. She remembered the surname. She had not, until this moment, connected it to the man sitting beside her. She looked at Declan Slade directly for the first time since they had left the highway. He met her gaze, without flinching, and neither of them spoke for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. She thought, this man believes he has a score to settle. She thought, he has had 7 years to plan whatever this is. She thought, I am 40 minutes from a meeting that determines whether my company survives, and I am sitting in a van with a stranger who may have sabotaged my car to get me here. Declan said he had not come for her. He had not come for Harlow MedTech. He had come because Theodore Granger had summoned him after 7 years of silence, and he intended to know why before he went home to his daughter. Something in the evenness of his voice made her decide, provisionally, to believe him. She settled back in her seat and they drove the last 11 miles to Galena without speaking. The Granger estate sat at the end of a private road lined with spruce trees, its iron gates flanked by a row of black SUVs that could only belong to one person's security detail. Declan guided the van through the gates and parked it between two vehicles that cost more than most houses in that county. A man in a dark jacket approached immediately, glanced at the van's cracked mirror and faded logo, and asked if Declan had a delivery. Adrienne stepped out first. The same man straightened at once and addressed her by her full title. Preston Wycliffe appeared on the front steps. Moments later, silver-haired and smiling with the practiced ease of a person who had spent decades making people feel that his attention was a gift. He remarked loudly on Adrienne's unconventional choice of transportation. He turned to Declan and withdrew a folded bill from his breast pocket and suggested he take the van around to the service entrance where the groundskeeping staff parked. Declan did not take the money. He said simply that he had also been invited. Preston's smile stretched. He suggested to Adrienne, in a murmur calibrated to sound like concern, that the man appeared to be attempting to exploit the situation. Miles Harford materialized at Preston's elbow and looked at Declan's face for several seconds before leaning close and saying something that made Preston's expression shift, just once, before resettling into calm. Preston instructed the security staff to escort Declan off the property. Two men began moving toward the van with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. It was at that moment that the front door opened and a woman in a charcoal wool suit stepped onto the steps. "Harriet Odom," she said, introducing herself as the attorney for the Granger estate. She walked directly to Declan and extended her hand and told the assembled group that the proceedings could not begin until both designated parties were present. She then turned to Preston Wycliffe and informed him, with a pleasantness that contained no warmth whatsoever, that the chair at the head of the table had been reserved for Declan Slade. The security staff stopped moving. The staff who had been watching from the door went very still. Adrienne felt the ground shift beneath everything she had assumed since reading that letter. Because the man she had nearly dismissed as an obstacle in a work van was, she was beginning to understand, the entire reason this gathering existed at all. Inside Theodore Granger's study, dark shelves reached to a high ceiling, and a long table had been prepared with water glasses and a projector screen, and a single sealed case larger than all the envelopes combined. Harriet Odom stood at the head of the room and explained that Theodore Granger had recorded a video message before his death. One he had required be played only once both designated parties were present in the same room. The lights dimmed. Theodore Granger's voice came from a recording made, by the look of him on screen, approximately 8 months before he died. He was thinner than the photographs Adrienne had seen of him, and he spoke with the deliberate care of someone who has already run out of time for anything but the truth. He said that the AI diagnostic algorithm known as ClearScan, a system capable of detecting early-stage cardiac abnormalities with an accuracy rate no existing technology had matched, had been designed from its mathematical foundation by Declan Slade. He said that he had known, from the day after the data breach, that Declan had not caused it. He had known who had. He had stayed silent because the man who orchestrated it controlled the capital that kept Granger Diagnostics alive for 2 more years. And by the time that capital ran out anyway, the silence had calcified into something he no longer knew how to break. Adrienne glanced sideways. Declan sat with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on the screen, and his jaw was tight, in the way that means a person is holding very still, because moving would cost them something they cannot afford to lose in a room full of strangers. Theodore Granger continued, The will granted Declan Slade the role of technical custodian over ClearScan. No license, no sale, no clinical deployment could proceed without his written approval. The commercial stewardship would pass to Adrienne Harlow, given Harlow MedTech's existing infrastructure and her demonstrated record of bringing regulated medical technology to market responsibly. Neither guardian could act without the other. If they failed to reach a joint agreement by noon the following day, ClearScan would transfer into a protected research trust and remain inaccessible to any commercial entity for a decade. Preston Wycliffe offered Declan $3 million for his custodianship rights before the recording had fully ended. He named the figure the way people name figures when they believe money is the only language worth speaking. Declan said no without hesitation, and the certainty of it seemed to disturb Preston more than any negotiation would have. Harriet Odom placed a small brass key on the table and said that Theodore Granger had left a sealed laboratory beneath the estate. Only the two custodians together held the authority to open it. What waited inside, she said, would determine considerably more than either of them yet understood. The stairs behind a panel of bookshelves led down to a room that smelled of cold air and old circuitry. Server banks stood along the walls in the dark. At the center of the room sat a working prototype housing. ClearScan's processing core, its casing worn from years of testing, connected to an offline server that required a startup sequence. Declan entered from memory, his fingers moving without hesitation through a series of commands he clearly had not needed to look up in 7 years. Adrienne watched the screens come to life around him and understood, in a way that rearranged something she hadn't known needed rearranging, that the man in the repair van was not simply competent. She had worked with engineers for 20 years. She knew what mastery looked like. Declan found the problem within the first hour, buried 6 layers deep in the production version of the algorithm, the version Miles Harford had been pushing her to fast-track through FDA clearance for the past 4 months. A section of code had been modified. The original algorithm had weighted diagnostic sensitivity evenly across patient demographics. The modified version traded accuracy in older patients with multiple comorbidities for a cleaner average performance number. The kind of number that looked excellent in a regulatory submission. The kind that would fail, in real clinical settings, on the patients who needed it most. Not often, not in ways that would be immediately obvious. Just enough, across a large enough deployment, to constitute a catastrophe measured one family at a time. Adrienne recognized the version. She had seen it in every slide deck Miles had prepared for their board presentations over the past year. She understood, standing in that cold laboratory, exactly what she had nearly put her name on. They worked through the evening cross-referencing, the original development logs against the modified code, Adrienne bringing her knowledge of regulatory timelines and production requirements, while Declan traced each altered parameter back through the version history with the patience of someone reconstructing a crime scene. They disagreed twice, sharply, about methodology, Adrienne pushing for speed and Declan declining every shortcut that touched patient safety with a flatness that she eventually stopped arguing against, because he was right and she knew it. In a quieter moment, she told him the company had less than 8 weeks of operating capital remaining if Preston's credit line was pulled. It was the first time she had said the actual number to anyone outside her own reflection in the bathroom mirror. Declan said, without looking up from the screen, that his daughter had been 9 years old when he lost his engineering license. That he had spent the next 3 years fighting a legal system that had already decided what happened. That his wife had gotten sick during those years, while he was too consumed with clearing a name he'd already lost to be present the way he should have been. That Tessa was 12 now, and that he refused to let another family pay the cost of decisions made by people who would never feel the consequences. Adrienne did not answer immediately. The fluorescent light above them hummed. Somewhere in the main house, Preston Wycliffe was almost certainly making calls. Declan found what he had spent 7 years unable to prove in an archived system log at 11:47 in the evening. A digital signature, an authorization key belonging to Miles Harford, attached to the exact code modification that had ended Declan's career, time-stamped 3 days before the breach that destroyed the clinical records and rerouted the blame onto a user account registered under Declan's credentials. He turned the screen toward Adrienne and walked her through each line. The evidence was clear. A portion of the surrounding data remained encrypted, which meant it would require additional forensic work to be legally airtight. But it was unmistakably a beginning. Adrienne did not want to believe it. Miles Harford had been at her company for 9 years. He had been in the hospital the night her father had surgery. He had sent flowers to her mother's funeral. She sat with the screen in front of her and felt the particular vertigo of discovering that trust and loyalty are not the same thing. Declan told her gently that a person's history with you can't tell you who they are when no one is watching. Instead of confronting Miles directly, Adrienne called him down to the laboratory under the pretense of reviewing a regulatory timeline. The moment suspicion entered his voice, Miles began denying everything. He said Declan had fabricated the records. He said the whole setup was a revenge scheme 7 years in the making. Preston arrived moments later with the instinct of a person who has survived by sensing which way the room was turning. Together they constructed a plausible alternative. Declan had motive. Declan had access. Declan had showed up at the right place at the right time. The narrative had a certain logic to it, the kind of logic that works on people who want to be reassured rather than convinced. Preston offered Adrienne a private arrangement. If she removed Declan from the process, Wycliffe Capital would extend Harlow Medtech's debt obligations by 18 months and step away from the ClearScan negotiation permanently. Miles produced a document placing full personal and legal liability for any future failure of ClearScan directly onto Declan Slade. All Adrienne had to do was sign. She read the document slowly. The language was tight and professional and designed to be signed in a moment of exhaustion. She recognized the architecture of it, the same kind of quiet transaction that had erased Declan Slade's career 7 years ago. Powerful people preparing to sacrifice a man who had done nothing wrong because the alternative was inconvenient. She set the pen down. She moved, without announcing it, to stand on the same side of the room as Declan. Preston's expression cooled in an instant. He said Wycliffe Capital would begin unwinding its entire financing relationship with Harlow Medtech at 9 o'clock the following morning. He said it the way someone says a thing when they believe the threat alone should be sufficient. Declan told Adrienne quietly that she was free to step back, that he would carry no resentment toward her, that he understood what she stood to lose. She said that she had watched enough companies fold from the inside out to understand the difference between a business that was saved and one that was simply preserved in whatever shape its worst decisions had given it. She said she was not interested in the second kind. When they returned to the laboratory to secure what they had found, every server had gone dark. The drive Declan had been using was gone. The power failure was isolated to a single circuit beneath the main house. Declan noticed immediately. He traced the outage to a deliberate cut. He found a small jamming device behind an access panel, the kind of equipment that required knowledge of the building's layout and didn't arrive accidentally. The hallway cameras had gone dark for precisely 6 minutes. Miles claimed he had been upstairs the entire time. He produced no evidence that he had. Declan did not search Miles's pockets or his briefcase. He opened a diagnostics app on his phone and pulled a Bluetooth signal that was broadcasting from somewhere in the estate's private motor court. He walked outside. Preston Wycliffe's driver watched from 20 feet away as Declan crouched beside the rear wheel well of Preston's car and retrieved the missing drive from a magnetic case tucked behind the undercarriage. He explained to Harriet Odom, who had followed him outside, that he had built a passive Bluetooth tracker into every device he owned after losing everything the first time. He had learned, the hard way, that valuable things needed witnesses. Harriet ordered the estate gates sealed. Adrienne, working from her laptop in the main house, had already spent the intervening hour pulling financial records through her executive access to Harlow MedTech's accounts. What she found was a payment trail routed through a shell company that had been receiving quarterly transfers from a Wycliffe Capital subsidiary for the better part of 4 years. Miles Harford's name was not on the shell company, but his personal signatures were on the authorization documents that had established it. The full board meeting happened by video call, beginning at 6 in the morning with the kind of mandatory attendance that leaves no room for convenient scheduling conflicts. Preston joined from a guest room in the estate with the composure of a man who had survived board rooms before and expected to survive this one. He spoke first, with confidence, and declared that Adrienne had failed to secure any legitimate guardianship agreement, and that the board should act to stabilize the company by accepting his revised terms immediately. Miles, his position already suspended by Harriet's legal authority under the estate's protective clause, submitted a written statement recommending the board vote to remove Adrienne from her position. Several members asked pointedly why the fate of the company's flagship technology should depend in any meaningful way on the opinion of a man who repaired diagnostic equipment in a county most of them could not locate on a map. Declan did not respond to that description of himself. He presented the safety data instead. He walked the board through exactly what the modified algorithm would do in practice, with the specificity and steadiness of someone who understood both the engineering and the human cost of getting it wrong. He showed them who would be misdiagnosed and why. He showed them the statistical projections across a patient population of 300,000, which was Harlow MedTech's projected first-year deployment target. One board member asked him to establish his credentials. Harriet Odom presented the original patent filings, the employment records from Granger Diagnostics, and the explicit terms of Theodore Granger's will, which together established that Declan Slade was not an inconvenient outside party, but the foundational architect of the technology being discussed. Adrienne followed with the financial evidence, the payment trail, the shell company, the authorization signatures, the pattern of decisions extending across 4 years that had deliberately deepened Harlow MedTech's dependence on Wycliffe Capital, while systematically obscuring the company's actual financial position from its own board. Miles Harford's suspension was made permanent on the spot. The board voted to refer the financial records to regulators before the call ended. Preston Wycliffe withdrew his threat with the kind of controlled exit that comes from understanding, all at once, that the room has turned in a direction that cannot be reversed by a larger number. The new investment framework Adrienne and Declan had spent the overnight hours assembling, structured, around ClearScan's validated safety standards, licensed to Harlow MedTech under terms that protected the algorithm's integrity, and directed a percentage of future earnings into intellectual property restoration, attracted immediate support from a hospital systems consortium that Harriet had quietly approached the previous evening. The board rejected the motion to remove Adrienne from her position. They accepted the restructuring plan by a margin that left Preston Wycliffe nothing useful to say. Adrienne told the board, before the call ended, that the person who had made that morning possible was not an investor. He was a man who had shown up to fix something broken on the side of a highway and had ended up refusing, at considerable personal cost, to let a second injustice be buried under the first one. The full accounting of what had happened 7 years ago at Granger Diagnostics became public in the weeks that followed. Released through a detailed filing that Harriet Odom had been preparing for months, the moment both custodians agreed to proceed. Declan Slade's name was formally cleared of every allegation. His role as the original designer of ClearScan's core architecture was restored in the patent record and acknowledged in the regulatory submission. The correction ran in 4 medical industry publications and 1 national newspaper. Miles Harford faced criminal investigation. Preston Wycliffe's firm settled civil suits from Granger Diagnostics investors without admitting anything, which was the closest people like Preston Wycliffe ever came to admitting everything. Adrienne held a press conference in early November and stood before the cameras and acknowledged that her company had benefited from a system built on another person's stolen work, and that she intended to spend whatever remained of her career building something worth the name it carried. The admission was uncomfortable and widely covered, and cost her nothing that mattered. What it returned, over the following months, was the kind of credibility that cannot be manufactured. Declan declined every offer of a title. He agreed to chair a clinical safety board that would oversee ClearScan's continued development and deployment review, a role structured around a schedule that allowed him to be home on Granger Hill Road, the irony of the address not lost on either of them, by 5:30 every evening. He kept his repair business open. The diagnostic equipment he serviced kept working. Tessa continued to decorate his coffee cups with crayon stars, which she informed him was her contribution to professional branding. ClearScan passed every independent clinical audit in the spring. The results exceeded even Declan's private projections, which said something about the difference between an algorithm built correctly and one built to look correct. Adrienne drove out to his shop on a Tuesday in March that offered the first genuinely warm afternoon of the year. She arrived alone, no assistant, no driver, nothing in her hand except her keys and a quietness that people carry when they have stopped performing for an audience. She told Declan that there was nothing wrong with the car. She told him she knew how to get there on her own this time, and that getting there on her own was not the problem she was trying to solve. Declan locked the shop, and they drove out together into the pale afternoon light, with the hills still brown at the edges and the road ahead entirely clear. 2 people who had each, in the span of one rainy October evening, given the other something the other had not known they were missing. The first time Adrienne Harlow climbed into that work van, she had done it because she had no other choice left. The second time, she did it because she finally understood exactly what kind of choice she was making.